No one survives this. That's not a warning from a horror movie. It's the brutal clinical truth of what happened inside a quaint little rock bungalow in the pre-dawn hours of October 20th, 2008. This is the story of Anne Presley's terrible last night. What went deadly for a young woman who was the picture of success and safety. The day began with a silent alarm. It was a Monday morning, just after 4 a.m. Anne Presley, a 26-years-old news anchor for KATV's Good Morning Arkansas, had not called her mother for their usual wake-up check-in. This was their ritual. Anne was responsible, punctual, a professional whose day started before the sun. The silence was a screaming red flag. Her mother rushed to Anne's home on North Linden Street. What she found when she entered her daughter's bedroom would haunt her forever. This was no medical emergency. This was a massacre in a place of peace. Anne was in her bed, but she was utterly unrecognizable. She had been savagely beaten. Her face was a landscape of trauma, bones crushed by repeated, monstrous blows. Her left hand was broken, a desperate defense against an attack that came as she slept. The scene was one of such profound violation that it seemed impossible this was the same woman who, just hours before, had been a smiling, familiar face to thousands of Arkansas's viewers. So, who was Anne Presley when the sun was still up? And how does a life so full of light end in such consuming darkness? Before we continue, this channel is dedicated to telling real crime stories with care and respect. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, please subscribe, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Anne wasn't just a reporter. She was a rising star. Charming, ambitious, and intelligent, she had a political science degree from Rhodes College and had even landed a small role in a major film. To her community, she was the friendly, trusted voice with the morning coffee. Her home was her sanctuary, a reflection of her bright future. Yet, in the space of one night, that sanctuary became a tomb, and that future was stolen in an explosion of violence that defied all reason. The immediate question for police was stark. Was this personal? A stalker targeting a local celebrity? Or was it something even more random, and therefore more terrifying? As paramedics fought to stabilize the unfathomable damage and rush Anne to St. Vincent Infirmary, detectives stood in the chaos of her bedroom, looking for an answer in the awful silence. They were looking at a crime scene that screamed of rage, but whispered no clear motive. The only thing that was certain? Whoever did this didn't just want to rob her. They wanted to erase her. And as Anne clung to life in a coma, the race was on to find a monster who believed they'd gotten away with murder, to understand the shock that reverberated through Arkansas. You have to step back from that bloodied bedroom. You have to see the world Anne Presley commanded just hours before the attack. What does a life that touches thousands look like up close? And what happens when that life is violently severed from the stage it's so gracefully occupied? Anne Sparkman Presley was, by every measure, a young woman who had arrived. At 26, she wasn't just on television. She was a trusted part of people's daily routines. As a co-host on KATV's Good Morning Arkansas and Midday Arkansas, her face was synonymous with reliability and warm professionalism. She didn't just read the news. She connected with her community, making the broad strokes of current events feel personal, local, important. Her ambition had already carried her beyond the anchor desk. She'd landed a brief, symbolic role as a conservative commentator in Oliver Stone's film W. A nod to her sharp mind and on-camera poise. But who was she when the studio lights went off? The contrast is what makes the crime so dissonant. Her private world revolved around her beloved bungalow on North Linden Street. It was her haven, decorated with care, a reflection of the Southern charm and personal success she embodied. Friends and colleagues described her as generous, faith-driven, and exceptionally close to her family. Hence the morning call ritual with her mother. This was not a reckless life on the edge. This was a life of orderly ambition, deep roots, and cherished privacy. So, how does a fortress of personal safety become the epicenter of such grotesque violence? What did the killer see when he looked at her home? The terrifying answer may lie in the very normalcy she cherished. Anne Presley's world was one of predictable patterns. Early mornings, a familiar commute, a recognizable face. Her home, while charming, was just another house on a quiet street. To a predator, the trappings of her success, the well-kept home, the visible career, might not have signaled a person, but a target, an opportunity. This is the chilling pivot of the case. The difference between being targeted and being available. Her public visibility offered no shield. In fact, it may have created a dangerous illusion. We think we know public figures. We feel a false intimacy. For Anne, her profession was about connection. But for a predator scanning for vulnerability, her routine and her address were just pieces of exploitable data. This forces a horrifying question. Did her success, her very visibility, somehow mark her home as a prize? As Anne lay in a coma, fighting a battle she would ultimately lose 5 days later, her public and private worlds collided in a wave of grief. Viewers mourned the anchor they invited into their homes each morning. Friends and family mourned the vibrant, complex woman they loved. The investigation now had to operate in two realms: the bright, public persona of Anne Presley, TV anchor, and the violated, private reality of Anne, the victim. The key to bridging those worlds wouldn't be found in a stalker's letter or a professional grudge. It would be found in something cold, random, and hiding in plain sight, the simple, terrible logic of a burglary. But if this was just a burglary, why was it so viciously, personally brutal? The search for that answer would lead detectives down a dark path to a man whose own history was a blueprint for violence. As Anne Presley fought for her life in the hospital, detectives worked a crime scene that told two conflicting stories. One story was of a tidy, successful life. The other was of a savage, intimate violation. The evidence began to point away from a personal stalker and towards a more chaotic, and in some ways more frightening, possibility. This wasn't a plot. It was a collision. But what kind of person brings this level of violence into a stranger's home? The emerging theory was a burglary. Items were missing: Anne's laptop, her handbag. Her credit card was used at a gas station later that morning. This suggested an opportunist, not an assassin. But here's where the facts curdle into horror. A typical burglar flees when discovered. They grab and run. This person didn't flee. They escalated. Catastrophically. The attack was one of overwhelming, close-quarters brutality. The weapon, according to investigative sources, was believed to be something like a garden tool, a heavy, blunt object wielded with fury. Anne was attacked as she slept. The broken bones in her left hand, a classic defensive wound, indicate she woke to the nightmare, raising her arm in a futile attempt to shield herself from blows that shattered her facial bones and inflicted fatal brain trauma. This wasn't just a beating to silence a witness. It was an obliteration, and it got worse. Evidence at the scene, later corroborated by her parents' heartbreaking statements, indicated Anne was also sexually assaulted. This critical detail transforms the crime's motive. It was no longer a simple theft that turned violent. It was a theft that provided an opportunity for a deeper, more sadistic predation. The burglary was the gateway. The assault and murder were the objective. So, who was capable of this? The profile shifted to a person with a propensity for violence, particularly sexual violence, who saw a vulnerable target. This wasn't about Anne Presley, the person. This was about a woman, alone in a house, whose life he could dominate and then discard. But this theory poses another unsettling question. If the killer was this volatile, this dangerous? Had he done this before? Was Anne his first victim? Or just his latest? The police now had a dual task: find the man who used Anne's credit card, and find the man whose DNA was left at the scene of a horrific assault. They released sketches and descriptions of a suspect and a vehicle, appealing to the public. They were chasing a ghost who moved between the mundane act of buying gas and the monstrous act of murder. The pressure was immense. Every passing hour Anne remained in a coma was an hour her attacker remained free, potentially stalking his next opportunity. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was pounding, and the key to stopping it was already in their hands, waiting to be matched in a cold database. The question was, would they find the match before he struck again? For weeks, the investigation into Anne Presley's attack seemed to move in agonizing slow motion. A suspect sketch was publicized. Tips flooded in. But the break that would crack the case wide open wasn't found on a gas station surveillance tape or from a neighbor's account. It was found in a microscopic strand of evidence and in a violent crime from a town over 100 miles away. How does a clue from another county become the linchpin for a capital murder case? The answer is cold, scientific, and undeniable: DNA. While Anne's stolen credit card led to a fleeting image of a user, the biological evidence from her bedroom told a permanent story. Police processed the scene with one critical question: had the attacker left a part of himself behind? The answer was yes. But a DNA profile is useless unless you have something, or someone, to match it to. Enter a separate, unsolved case from the spring of 2008 in Marianna, Arkansas. Months before Anne Presley was attacked, a woman in that town had been raped. The assailant had left DNA evidence. That profile sat in a database, a silent scream waiting for a name. When the Little Rock police ran the DNA from Anne's scene, they got a cold hit. It matched the Marianna rape. This changed everything. The man who attacked Anne Presley wasn't just a burglar who snapped. He was a repeat violent offender, a sexual predator. The two crimes, separated by time and distance, were now irrevocably linked by the same man's biological signature. The investigation instantly had a direction, a pattern of behavior, and a terrifying confirmation of the predator's motive. He wasn't after televisions or jewelry. He was after victims. But a DNA profile isn't a face or a name. How do you go from a genetic code to an arrest? The public appeal with the sketch and vehicle description now had renewed desperate urgency. And it worked. Tips from the public, combined with dogged police work, tracing the movements from the credit card use and the Marianna case, finally focused the lens on one man, Curtis Lavelle Vance. At 28 years old from Marianna, Vance's location connected him to the earlier rape. His physical description matched the sketch. When police brought him in for questioning on November 26, 2008, his story unraveled. He gave conflicting statements about his whereabouts on October 20th. He had no solid alibi. And most damning of all, when they took a sample of his DNA, it was a perfect match to both crime scenes. The manhunt was over. The ghost had a name and a face. But with the arrest came a new, grim reality. Curtis Vance had been walking free for over a month after attacking Anne Presley. For over 5 months since the Marianna rape. This was a predator who operated in the shadows, crossing county lines, believing his crimes were disconnected and untraceable. He was wrong. Science had connected the dots, building a bridge of guilt from one shattered woman's life to another's. The evidence was now a fortress. But would it be enough to secure the ultimate justice for Anne Presley? Or would the legal system offer him a chance she was never given? With Curtis Lavelle Vance in custody and a DNA match linking him irrevocably to the crime, the legal path seemed straightforward. The evidence was a prosecutor's dream. Forensic science, a prior violent pattern, and a victim whose story had captured the heart of the state. A capital murder trial loomed, with the death penalty on the table. For Anne Presley's family and a horrified public, this promised the clearest form of justice. But the courtroom often deals in complexities, not closure. What price would be paid to secure a verdict? The trial commenced in November 2009. The prosecution presented its damning sequence: the opportunistic burglary, the catastrophic escalation, into sexual assault and a beating of unimaginable brutality, the DNA proof that placed Vance in Anne's bedroom. The defense, facing a scientific mountain, had little ground to stand on. The jury's decision was swift. Curtis Lavelle Vance was found guilty on all counts: capital murder, rape, residential burglary, and theft. Then came the sentencing phase. This is where the case took a turn that left many grappling for understanding. The jury was presented with two options: death by lethal injection or life in prison without the possibility of parole. To secure a death sentence, the jury had to be unanimous. They were not. After deliberation, they chose life without parole. The reasoning, as reported, involved mitigating factors presented by the defense about Vance's troubled background. For the court, the matter was settled. Vance received his life sentence, plus additional decades for the other charges. He would die in prison. Legally, justice had been served. But for Anne's family and a community that had lived through the terror, did a life sentence for such a brutal, predatory murder feel like true justice? Or was it a compromise that left a permanent, aching question? This leads to the most haunting, unresolved shadow of the entire case: the question of randomness. Officially, the motive was an opportunistic burglary that escalated. Vance did not know Anne Presley. She was not targeted for her fame. And that is perhaps the most terrifying conclusion of all. Her death was a matter of tragic, violent chance. Her home was chosen. She was inside. But can a crime this intimate, this vicious, ever truly be considered random? The violence was personal, even if the selection was not. This dissonance is what lingers. It's why the question, what went deadly, for her, has a simple yet profoundly unsatisfactory answer: being home, being present when evil walked through the door. Her terrible last night was the result of being in the path of a predator whose history showed he was a ticking time bomb, and her address was where the clock hit zero. Anne Presley's legacy is therefore a double-edged sword. It is the memory of a luminous life, a career of promise extinguished, and it is a permanent, chilling reminder of a vulnerability that exists in the most mundane of places, our own homes, in our own beds. The system caught her killer and put him away forever. But it could not answer the deeper, more painful why that her parents must carry. It could only confirm the darkest truth of all. Sometimes, the only thing that goes deadly is the unspeakable bad luck of crossing paths with a monster. In the end, the title of her story holds its awful truth. No one survives that. Thank you for watching.